What did women do in the Middle Ages, really? Were they always locked away, sewing in silence? Did their lives truly look the same, whether they lived in icy Scandinavia or sun-drenched Iberia, from the 5th century to the 15th century? Number 1, medieval women were solely domestic homemakers. Many people picture medieval women only within the walls of a castle or a small hut, focused entirely on cooking and cleaning. This image makes it seem like women did not contribute much outside the home, but historical records tell a much richer story. The reality for medieval women was far more diverse, with women actively participating in many aspects of public and economic life, often out of necessity. Their roles extended far beyond what many modern ideas suggest, varying significantly by region and social standing. In rural communities across Western Europe, especially among the vast majority of the population who were peasants, women were absolutely essential to agricultural survival. They were not merely helping out, their labor was critical for producing food and managing resources for their families and communities. And manorial records from England, such as those from the Winchester College Estates, show women engaged in every stage of farming. They would work alongside men in the fields, sowing seeds in spring, weeding crops throughout the summer, and participating vigorously in the harvest of grain in late summer and early autumn. They would also gather fuel, such as firewood or peat, and collect wild foods from forests and common lands. Women were often responsible for tending smaller livestock like chickens, geese, and pigs, which provided eggs, meat, and fat. They managed the dairy, milking cows and goats and transforming milk into cheese and butter, which were vital for nutrition and could be sold at market. Beyond direct agriculture, women were the primary processors of food. They ground grain using hand mills, kneaded dough, and baked bread, often in communal ovens. They brewed ale, a staple drink for all ages in medieval Europe, not just for family consumption, but often for sale. Women would make cheese, preserve meats by salting or smoking, and dry fruits and vegetables to ensure food security through the long winter months. In villages and towns, women often operated small businesses from their homes or market stalls. They would sell their surplus produce, eggs, dairy, or ale. The records from medieval German towns illustrate women as active sellers in markets, dealing in everything from vegetables to textiles. Textile production was another enormous industry dominated by women. From the raw materials to the finished cloth, women performed nearly every step. They prepared wool, flax, and hemp by cleaning and carding or retting. Spinning yarn was a continuous task for women across all social classes, a constant hum of activity that often accompanied other household chores. Weaving was also commonly done by women, particularly in Flanders and England, regions famous for their wool cloth. Where women dyed the fibers or finished cloth using natural pigments and then cut and sewed garments for their families or for sale. This was not merely a domestic craft, it was a significant economic activity. Guild records from medieval Paris list women as silk weavers, embroiderers, and makers of various specialized textiles, demonstrating their professional engagement in these trades. In urban centers, women held a diverse range of occupations beyond textiles. Many women ran businesses directly. They were often innkeepers, managing guest houses, serving food and drink, and overseeing staff. They operated taverns, providing a social hub for their communities. Some women were butchers, fishmongers, or candle makers. Historical documents from Italian city-states like Florence and Venice reveal women managing shops, dealing in luxury goods, or working as money changers, showing their deep involvement in the burgeoning commercial economy. For example, records show widows in Venice taking over their deceased husband's mercantile businesses and continuing to trade successfully. Healing and midwifery were almost exclusively female domains. Women served as the primary caregivers and medical practitioners within their communities, relying on generations of accumulated knowledge about herbal remedies, poultices, and traditional healing practices. They treated illnesses, set broken bones, and provided comfort to the sick. And midwives, in particular, held a crucial and respected position. They attended births, assisted mothers, and cared for newborns, often possessing specialized knowledge passed down through female lineages. Their expertise was vital for public health and survival in a time before modern medicine. Even noblewomen, though seemingly more confined by social expectations, often had immense administrative responsibilities. While their husbands were away on military campaigns, crusades, or at court, noblewomen were left to manage vast estates and castles. This was no small task. They oversaw hundreds of servants, managed agricultural production, handled legal disputes with tenants, collected rents, and maintained the physical structures of their residences. They administered justice within their lordships, made financial decisions, and ensured the smooth running of complex households. The letters of Margaret Paston, a 15th century English noblewoman, vividly illustrate her active role in managing family lands, handling legal challenges, and dealing with various tenants and laborers while her husband was absent. In some extreme circumstances, women even took on military roles, though this was rare and usually born of necessity. During sieges, women were known to participate in the defense of castles, fetching water for the defenders, carrying stones to the battlements, and even sometimes fighting directly. The most famous example is Jeanne d'Arc, a 15th century peasant girl who led the French army. While unique, her story shows that the idea of women in warfare was not entirely inconceivable, especially when the very survival of a community was at stake. Regional historical accounts from the Iberian Peninsula also describe women participating in the defense of towns during the Reconquista. Number 2. Medieval women dress modestly and drably without fashion. The common image of medieval women dressed in shapeless, drab garments is far from the whole truth. While practicality and social status certainly influenced clothing, fashion was a real and evolving force throughout the Middle Ages, with regional differences providing a vibrant tapestry of styles. People, especially those with wealth, cared deeply about their appearance and used clothing to signal their status and identity. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that fashion existed and was even a concern for society comes from the very laws that tried to control it. Across Europe, from the 13th to the 15th centuries, numerous sumptuary laws were enacted. These laws dictated what specific social classes could and could not wear, often restricting the use of expensive fabrics, furs, jewels, and certain colors to the nobility. The very need for these laws proves that people, including women, were spending lavishly on clothes and accessories, striving to outdo each other and flaunt their wealth. If everyone dressed in simple, drab clothing, such laws would have been unnecessary. For example, in 14th century England, sumptuary laws regulated the length of gowns and the types of furs that could be worn by women of different income levels. Similar laws existed in French cities and the Italian city-states of Florence and Venice, reflecting a widespread desire for fashionable display. For noblewomen, particularly in the High and Late Middle Ages, clothing was anything but drab. Rough gowns were often made from rich, imported fabrics like silk, damask, and velvet. These materials were expensive, and their colors were vibrant, achieved through costly dyes such as woad for blue, madder for red, and saffron for yellow. Illuminations in manuscripts, such as the Tresrich's Hoyer's du Duc de Berry from the early 15th century, show noblewomen in elaborate, form-fitting gowns with cinched waists, wide sleeves, and sometimes long, flowing trains. Their clothing was often embroidered with intricate patterns using gold and silver thread, pearls, and precious stones. Headwear was particularly elaborate, ranging from complex braided styles adorned with nets and circlets to the towering head ends, conical hats often draped with veils, or the butterfly headdress, which featured wired veils. These styles were not uniform, but evolved over time and varied by court and region. Byzantine fashion, for example, presented a distinct style. Empresses and noblewomen in Constantinople wore incredibly opulent silks, often woven with intricate patterns and gold thread, adorned with jewels. Their imperial garments were designed to convey power and sanctity, often featuring long, flowing robes and elaborate head coverings that differentiated them from simpler Western European styles. The art from the Hagia Sophia and other Byzantine churches showcases this lavishness. In Islamic Iberia, known as Al-Andalus, women's attire reflected a fusion of Islamic and local aesthetics. While modest in coverage, clothing was often luxurious. Women wore fine silks, muslins, and cottons, richly embroidered. They used perfumes, cosmetics, and elaborate hairstyles or veils. Descriptions from poets and travelers of the time, as well as surviving textile fragments, indicate a highly developed sense of style and refinement, which was far from drab. Even peasant women, while constrained by necessity and availability, did not necessarily dress drabbily. Their clothing was primarily functional, made from sturdy linen and wool produced at home or locally. However, they used natural dyes available to them, allowing for a range of colors from earthy tones to some brighter shades if the dyes were accessible. Simple tunics, aprons, and head coverings were common, but cuts and embellishments could vary regionally. For example, peasant women in parts of Scandinavia, as revealed by archaeological finds, wore layered garments with brooches and decorative pins, indicating a concern for appearance even in everyday wear. Undergarments and accessories further highlight the complexity of medieval dress. Women wore various layers, sometimes including forms of corsetry or bodices to shape their figures. They accessorized with belts, often highly decorated small purses, rings, necklaces, and decorative pins or fibulae to fasten cloaks and garments. Shoes were typically leather, but could be finely crafted and embroidered for the wealthy. The overall picture reveals that medieval women, depending on their social standing and geographical location, had a wide spectrum of clothing options, from the simplest functional garments to the most elaborate and luxurious displays of fashion. Number 3, medieval women had no legal rights and were considered property. The idea that medieval women had no legal rights and were simply possessions is a widespread misconception. While the legal systems were indeed patriarchal and often favored men, especially in matters of public office and land inheritance, the actual legal status of women varied enormously across different regions and time periods. Many legal frameworks, though complex, did grant women significant rights, particularly concerning property, inheritance, and even the ability to engage in legal proceedings. One of the most important legal protections for women in many parts of Western Europe was the concept of dower. A dower was a portion of a deceased husband's property, usually land, that his widow was legally entitled to for her support after his death. This was not a gift but a right, ensuring that widows were not left destitute. In England, for instance, a widow typically had a right to 1/3 of her late husband's lands for her lifetime. This right was legally enforceable, and she could take her husband's heirs to court if they tried to deny it. Similarly, in many Germanic legal traditions, a woman's dower rights were substantial, allowing her a degree of economic independence after widowhood. The concept of a dowry also played a significant role, though its legal implications varied. A dowry was the property, money, or goods that a bride brought into her marriage. In some regions, like the Italian city-states such as Florence, the dowry remained legally the wife's property, even if managed by her husband. Upon her husband's death, or if the marriage ended, the dowry was supposed to be returned to her or her family. This system protected a woman's financial interests and could even be used as capital for business ventures. For example, the legal records of 14th century Florence reveal elaborate contracts protecting women's dowries, allowing them considerable financial leverage. Inheritance laws were perhaps the most varied and critical area. While some regions, like parts of France under Salic law, largely excluded women from inheriting land and titles in the male line, other regions were far more open. In England, under common law, an unmarried woman, known as a tapple, feme sole, had full legal capacity. She could own property, make contracts, sue, and be sued. While a married woman's legal identity largely merged with her husband's feme covert, she still retained certain rights, particularly related to her dower and, in some cases, joint property. If there were no male heirs, noblewomen could and did inherit titles and vast lands, becoming powerful figures in their own right, such as Matilda, daughter of King Henry I, who fought to inherit the English throne in the 12th century. The Iberian kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, had legal traditions that often granted women more extensive property rights than in many other parts of Western Europe. Drawing on Roman and Visigothic influences, laws in these kingdoms frequently allowed daughters to inherit equally with sons if a will specified, or at least provided them with a substantial share. Women in Aragon and Catalonia, for example, had the right to manage their own separate property, even when married, and actively participated in legal disputes, initiating lawsuits and defending their rights in court. Legal documents from the Crown of Aragon frequently show women engaging in property transactions, buying and selling land, and making their own wills. Early Germanic and Norse laws also often provided women with significant rights regarding property ownership and inheritance. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age burials, where women were interred with property and tools, suggests a strong cultural tradition of female property ownership. The Icelandic sagas also contain numerous references to women who managed their own households and lands, making independent legal decisions. Although divorce in the modern sense was rare under the strictures of the medieval church, annulments were possible and sometimes sought by women. In some regions, and during specific periods, legal separations with financial provisions for the wife were also granted. Furthermore, in communities where marriage was not exclusively governed by church law, different customs could apply. For example, in early medieval Ireland, there were different forms of marriage, and women had specific rights within each, including the right to separate and retain their property under certain conditions. Finally, the right to make a will of testamentary rights was afforded to many women. Across various European legal systems, a woman, especially a widow or an unmarried woman, could draw up a will detailing how her movable and sometimes immovable property should be distributed after her death. These wills provide valuable insights into women's wealth and their ability to determine the future of their possessions. The wills of medieval women often meticulously list bequests of clothing, jewelry, household goods, and even land, demonstrating their legal agency over their personal estates. Number 4. Medieval women were oppressed, lacked agency, and were confined to the home. The image of medieval women as universally oppressed, stripped of all agency, and perpetually confined to the domestic sphere is a vast oversimplification. While societal norms were patriarchal and opportunities were often limited by social status and geography, countless women throughout the Middle Ages exercised significant power, made critical decisions, and operated far beyond the confines of their homes. Their lives were incredibly diverse, reflecting varied legal customs, economic realities, and political structures across different regions. A striking counterexample comes from the realm of royalty and high nobility. Women regularly served as powerful rulers and regents, defying any notion of universal confinement. Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century Italian countess, ruled a vast territory in central Italy, commanded armies, and played a crucial role in the investiture controversy, challenging the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Blanche of Castile, the 13th century Queen Regent of France, twice ruled the kingdom effectively during the minority of her son, Louis IX, and later during his crusade. She negotiated treaties, suppressed rebellions, and proved herself an astute and powerful politician. Isabella, the first of Castile in the late 15th century, co-ruled with her husband, Ferdinand II of Aragon, making joint decisions that reshaped the Iberian Peninsula and funded voyages across the Atlantic. These women were at the pinnacle of power, actively shaping national and international affairs. Beyond queens, noblewomen frequently held significant administrative and political roles. When their husbands were away on crusades, wars, or political duties, noblewomen were often left in charge of vast estates, manors, and castles. They managed finances, resolved legal disputes among tenants, oversaw agricultural production, and even organized the defense of their strongholds. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a 12th century duchess who became queen of both France and England, was an independent ruler of her own Duchy of Aquitaine, a powerful feudal lord in her own right, influencing politics and culture across Europe. In the bustling urban centers of medieval Europe, women played a vital and visible role in the economy, far removed from strict domestic confinement. Women were active in a wide array of guilds and trades. In cities like Paris, Cologne, and London, guild records show women working as silk weavers, embroiderers, brewers, bakers, candle makers, and even goldsmiths. They ran their own businesses, trained apprentices, and participated in the economic life of the city. For instance, in 13th century Paris, the Livre des Métiers Book of Trades compiled by Etienne Boileau lists dozens of trades where women worked independently or alongside their husbands. Many women ran taverns, inns, and shops, managing staff and finances, demonstrating considerable business acumen. Peasant women, who formed the majority of the population, were certainly not confined to the home. Their labor was indispensable to the family economy and agricultural production. They worked side by side with men in the fields, participating in every stage of farming, from sowing to harvesting. They cared for livestock, processed food, and managed the household economy, which was deeply intertwined with external agricultural activities. Their days were spent outdoors, in the community, and engaged in strenuous physical labor. Specific regional cultures also offered different degrees of female agency. Archaeological findings and sagas from Norse cultures, for example, suggest that Viking women enjoyed more autonomy compared to their counterparts in contemporary feudal Western Europe. They could own property, divorce, and were sometimes depicted as powerful household heads or even shield maidens, though the latter is debated. Burials from Viking Age Scandinavia have revealed women interred with weapons and tools, indicating diverse roles. Odd the Deep-Minded, a 9th century Norse woman, sailed across the North Atlantic, established a settlement in Iceland, and distributed land to her followers, demonstrating immense leadership and agency. In the Latin Crusader states, the precarious nature of life and the frequent absence of men, due to warfare, meant that women often took on unconventional roles. Noble women in the Levant were known to manage castles, administer territories, and even led troops in defense, adapting to the harsh realities of constant conflict. Similarly, in early medieval Slavic societies, particularly in Kievan Rus', historical evidence suggests women had more substantial legal and economic rights, including property ownership and active participation in trade, differing from the later feudal structures that developed in Western Europe. The Primary Chronicle, for example, mentions Princess Olga of Kiev, who ruled as regent in the 10th century and brutally avenged her husband's death, demonstrating formidable political and military authority. Number 5, medieval women were universally uneducated and illiterate. The belief that medieval women were universally uneducated and illiterate is a persistent myth that overlooks the varied educational opportunities and achievements of women across different social classes, regions, and periods within the Middle Ages. While formal schooling was not as widespread as today, and literacy rates generally lower than for men, many women were indeed literate, educated, and even scholarly, proving that access to knowledge was far from monolithic. One of the most significant centers of female learning was within convents and monasteries. For women who entered religious orders, literacy was often a prerequisite or a skill actively cultivated. Many convents became vibrant intellectual hubs where women learned to read, write, and study Latin, the language of scholarship and liturgy. They copied manuscripts, composed texts, and engaged in theological and philosophical discourse. A prime example is Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness from what is now Germany, who wrote plays, poems, and historical works in Latin, showcasing profound classical learning. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was another extraordinary intellectual figure. She composed complex liturgical music, wrote extensive treatises on theology, natural history, and medicine, and corresponded with emperors and popes. The double monasteries of Anglo-Saxon England, such as Whitby Abbey under Abbess Hilda, were centers of learning for both men and women, demonstrating early opportunities for female education. The records from numerous Italian convents also show nuns managing extensive libraries and engaging in scholarly pursuits. Among the nobility, private education was common, especially for daughters of wealthy and powerful families. Noblewomen often received tutoring in Latin, French, arithmetic, history, and courtly arts like music and needlework. These skills were essential for managing large estates, engaging in diplomacy, and participating in courtly life. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the 12th century Duchess and Queen of France and England, was renowned for her intelligence and patronage of poets and troubadours, indicating a highly literate and cultured court. Christine de Pizan, a 14th-15th century French writer, was a professional author who earned a living from her extensive writings, including works of history, poetry, and political commentary, often arguing for the dignity and intelligence of women. Her education allowed her to navigate the intellectual and political circles of her time. The Paston family letters from 15th century England reveal how Margaret Paston, a noblewoman, could read and write effectively, managing her family's intricate legal and financial affairs through extensive correspondence. In bustling urban centers, particularly in Italian city-states or Hanseatic League towns, women of the merchant class often acquired literacy and numeracy skills out of economic necessity. Wives of merchants frequently managed account books, handled business correspondence, and even ran family businesses while their husbands were away. Our guild records from Bologna, Italy, in the 13th and 14th centuries show women working as notaries and scribes, professions requiring high levels of literacy and legal knowledge. These women were integral to the commercial life of their cities. Education for women in the Byzantine Empire, especially within the aristocracy, was generally more common and structured than in many parts of Western Europe. Daughters of the elite were often educated at home by tutors studying classical Greek literature, philosophy, and history. Anna Comnena, a 12th century Byzantine princess and historian, authored the Alexiad, a detailed and sophisticated historical account of her father, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos' reign. Her work demonstrates remarkable intellectual rigor and classical scholarship. In Islamic Iberia, known as Al-Andalus, especially during its golden age of scholarship, women from elite families had opportunities for education. Cities like Cordoba and Granada were centers of learning, and some women distinguished themselves as scholars, poets, and calligraphers. Libraries contained vast collections of books, and some women were known to participate in scholarly discussions and even work as scribes, contributing to the vibrant intellectual life of the region. While formal education was less common for rural peasant women, their education focused on practical skills necessary for survival agriculture, food processing, household management, and traditional healing. This informal education was vital and passed down through generations. However, even within this group, there were regional variations. The sagas and archaeological findings from Scandinavia, for instance, sometimes hint at a broader general literacy or at least the ability to transmit complex oral traditions, suggesting different cultural approaches to knowledge acquisition. These diverse examples from different regions and social strata demonstrate that the educational landscape for medieval women was far more nuanced than the prevailing myth suggests. opportunities for learning and literacy existed, and many women seized them to become scholars, administrators, and active participants in the intellectual and economic life of their times.